Plato's idea, as he outlines in so many of his dialogues, including the Meno, but also the Phaedo, that a real discovery is more akin to the quality of a recollection than it is to adding something to an existent vessel.
Hi, welcome to Notions of Progress, the show that traces ideas of progress from antiquity to the age of AI. Notions of progress exist to surface how thinkers across history and across disciplines have understood what progress is, where it comes from, and how it manifests in the world. That includes academics and public intellectuals mapping its intellectual history and arguing for the traditions that they believe are still at work in shaping it. Previous episodes in this series have traced how the idea of progress has been understood, debated, and contested from antiquity to the present. Today, however, we open a different kind of conversation. In examining progress in action, we engage with thinkers who don't stand outside the debate, they're actually inside it, arguing that a specific tradition is not merely an idea about progress, but its actual engine. This series interview guest, Matt Ehret's argument is sweeping and direct. For 2,500 years, Western civilization has been shaped by a battle between two philosophical traditions. A Platonic conception that holds the human mind capable of genuine creative discovery versus an Aristotelian perspective that, in his view, systematically forecloses that capacity. Everything genuinely progressive in human history, Ehret argues, flows from the first tradition, and the central question he raises, whether the minds our civilization produces are capable of real discovery or are sophisticated prisoners of their own assumptions, is, he contends, as urgent now as it was in Plato's Athens. I hope you find it as rich and thought-provoking as I did. Here's my conversation with Matt Ehret. Today, we are very fortunate to have a very special guest on today, Matt Ehret. Matt is a Canadian journalist, historian, and a lecturer and a co-founder of the Montreal-based Rising Tide Foundation. He is editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and a senior fellow at the American University in Moscow. Matt contributes to a wide variety of publications that both him and his wife, Cynthia Chung, are frequent guests on a dizzying number of programs. His work spans intellectual history, geopolitics, philosophy, history, just to name a few disciplines. And today's show is going to be about the Platonic versus the Aristotelian divide as civilization fault lines. Matt also has a series of books, to name just a few: The Untold History of Canada in 4 volumes, The Clash of the Two Americas, and most recently, Science Unshackled. I'm going to put in the show notes all of Matt's work so that you can see it. But I think at this point, let me just move forward and welcome you, Matt. Thank you so much for coming on. It's a great honor and a pleasure to have you on.
Hey, thank you, Marshall. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, so I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Fantastic. Well, today, our main focus is to understand how ideas of progress were formed and how they act as an operating system, a fundamental way of thinking and a system that is carried on through time. For those who've watched the last few episodes of the show, we've been focusing on ancient Greece. We've discussed the Academy. We've discussed Plato's ideas in the Academy, where he got some of his ideas, Socrates, Aristotle. And I think today we take a short step and contextualize this information and understand what these ideas were, what the major convergence points were, and most importantly, how these ideas have carried forward. And just as an aside, just by virtue of the fact that we are discussing ancient Greece as an idea of progress, flies against, up till the early 20th century, the conventional opinion that progress began during the Enlightenment. So just even the idea of progress before is a revolutionary idea in and of itself. And with that, sorry for the long introduction, Matt, but I wanted to make sure that people, my listeners, got a good sense of kind of where you were coming from.
Thanks, man. I mean, that's a really great introduction. And I love what you're doing with this theme in this program overall to really help people develop a new relationship and appreciation of those causal ideas that gave rise to everything good about humanity and that have largely been the target of a misinformation campaign, I would say, or an organized, intentional misinformation campaign to sever us from a connection of those principled concepts and that way of thinking that has, at the best of times, brought humanity out of squalor, out of darkness, and into a better way, with a better sense of self-dignity, a better sense of freedom, and a better sense of, as you said, of progress, which manifests itself in a myriad of ways that all transcend the limits to our existence that we were otherwise, had we been less creative, inclined to adapt to as some form of zoo creature in a cage, happy with whatever the zookeeper gives it as foodstuffs inside of that cage. But humanity, in a more creative, more dignified state, has been inclined to resist, to find that suffocating spiritually, and to imagine a better world that is more fit for a society of justice, and act accordingly and shape their identities accordingly around that higher set of ideas. And whether that manifests in progress in sciences and technology, in the arts, in political freedom, it's all sort of different species of the same thing in my mind. And yeah, to not go, to end our investigation of where the origins of that movement are at the Enlightenment would do such a disservice and destroy our ability to, I think, properly understand the truth that this actually is something which is eminently examinable, investigatable in the ancient times of ancient Roman, Republican, and even earlier, especially earlier Greek literature, and understanding the fights, the personalities, not just the theories, but both the theories and the personalities of those players who moved humanity in such an interesting, anomalously powerful direction during that period. It's of such benefit. So I love the fact that you're doing this, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
What I don't think a lot of people realize is just even the word progress itself is something that's ingrained, and there's a lot of qualitative and quantitative understandings of progress. It's not a word that's a catch-all. The whole purpose of this show is to get on people like Matt who will come on and share a vision and an understanding of progress from their perspective, looking back through history. Because first and foremost, this show is about a historical reading and understanding the context of this. And lastly, before I turn this back over to Matt, it's important to also realize that the concept in and of itself that we are moving in some direction in history, whether that's progress or regress or no progress, is testament to the fact that 2,500 years later, we're still looking back at some of the folks that Matt's going to introduce us to today. That is astounding to me.
No, and it's an important point that you brought up there, because you're right. Like, there's no agreement on what that word means. There's so many theories of progress, and the word itself has become almost scandalous to use in our modern day. It used to be taken, people took it for granted, generations ago, that progress was a good thing, and there's a general consensus. Yeah, progress means getting better, not getting worse, things becoming more perfect, not less perfect, not more imperfect, but better in some way. And so today, I think people have found themselves in increasingly splintered, obfuscated academic exercises.
Exactly.
That have given these words semantic spin, and, papers, academic papers and other things have been published, and books have been published, making progress seem like a terrible thing, because progress according to who? Like, any word could be the good, the commonwealth, the good of the whole becomes almost a bad thing in that word too, in this worldview as well of absolute relativism, because according to whose standard are we using the word good and common good or progress? If it's a terrible fascist or somebody who wants to subjugate, who believes in the natural subjugation of the majority for the benefit of a small minority, then their idea of progress, of what you're using to gauge better or worse, is going to be perhaps atrocious, a terrible, terrible thing, because they're going to be progressing towards their disgusting goal. But if we have a baseline which is more objective, and I think such baselines do exist as standards, then we do have something, I think, that we can agree on more scientifically, though it may not be as mathematically satisfying for some people who wish to have mathematical certainty in everything that they say. That's not going to be something we could necessarily expect to attain. But if we assume, like, for example, in our own personal lives, that there's certain things that all human beings, independent of our culture, our opinions on things, all find value in, we have something to work with. And I think one of those things is like, okay, well, regardless if you're born today or 1,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago or in Africa or Asia or Europe or whatever, you probably will need water. You probably will need access to water, to avoid the consequences of the biophysical laws of lack of water, the shutdown of metabolic activity that comes with lack of nutrients of food, which, you know, you don't just want for yourself, but you also probably want for your kids, the family unit, whatever social group you find yourself within. You probably value whatever allows for clean, healthy substance to provide nourishment, shelter, warmth to keep you from freezing to death if you live in that part of the world, or something that allows for some shade and some... So there's certain basic things that are required to meet the laws of life. And presumably you wouldn't want to just meet them as things, as, you know, as scarcity increases over time as foodstuffs are eaten up, but you recognize that, oh, we'd probably want to improve the quality and means of acquiring those things that keep us healthy, that keep our loved ones healthy, that ensures more security for our kids than the type of security we perhaps didn't have as adults growing up, you know. And so I think everyone can agree in these general starting points, and then you could scale it up a little bit and say, okay, well, imagine now these types of invariants apply to all of society. That, okay, how can we make not just water certainty? What type of technologies allow for the increase of abundance? What types of things allow us to overcome wars, which increase usually uncertainty, scarcity, pain, suffering, injustice? So there's certain decisions that usually you could call progress if, you know, people actually have a healthy idea of what a normal, healthy human being and a human species should kind of be geared towards. And thus, with that healthy baseline as the doctor, I think the healthy doctor is not somebody who's just a master in sickness. They're such a master in the science of knowing disease because they have a baseline idea of what is healthy first and foremost as their standard.
Let me just zero in on one word that you said, because actually that describes the incentive for me doing this show to begin with, and that is the zeitgeist. And it was a zeitgeist from my own perspective regarding progress that is, in a sense, not a conclusion, but a sense that there are many people who don't feel that they're progressing and that they're moving backwards. And this is what a question that I thought was very interesting to explore. And especially in this particular episode, we're going to talk about ancient Greece. And you're going to see this is the fundamental operating system behind many of those ideas, getting to that truth that Matt described and that virtue. And I think today what I'd like to now cue up, Matt, is we're going to talk about three pivotal factors. Can we kind of like start in ancient Greece and just talk a little bit about ecosystem of the academy prior to its existence, i.e. Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, just a little bit about the context of what these folks were in, and then just talk a little bit about their fertilization at the academy and then the Lyceum, etc.
Sure, yeah. Well, I suppose, yeah, the Academy of Plato was the first such academy that, as far as I could tell, had ever been produced or generated by the human species in a way that is analogous to the sort of thing that we've seen in the period of the medieval ages and especially our current world. And it was a very new idea and innovation that young people could be brought to an institution qualified, as Plato said. If to enter his academy, to even qualify, people had lined up from far and wide because of the reputation of this incredible center of learning. You had to really master geometry. You had to at least demonstrate some knowledge of geometry. And there was an inscription above the entrance to the academy that said, "Let no one who does not know geometry enter these walls." And part of the reason that Plato had in his mind, as himself a geometrician, somebody who had mastered constructive geometry even before he set up the academy, he was friends. After all, Plato, before the academy, he was friends with Archytas, the great Archytas who discovered the doubling of the cube that nobody had figured out until Archytas was able to crack it, and involved this incredible, it wasn't a mathematical solution, it was entirely a geometrical solution involving a cone, a cylinder, and a sphere. To double a cube, you know, it's very different from doubling the square on a two-dimensional plane. But so this Archytas was very good friends with Plato, and Plato had worked with a number of people, had himself contributed to our understanding of the dodecahedron as the fifth Platonic solid. That's why they call them the Platonic solids, because Plato recognized that within the process of doing geometry correctly, constructively, you start with no axioms. There's no Euclidean assumptions. You just simply start with the challenge of trying to do a thing. You start with a square and you're like, well, I don't assume that I know a square. I have to construct it from only circular action. And then once I've discovered it, it's not based upon blind faith, but on real discoveries along the way of how do I know that these four vertices are in fact absolutely separated from a center point equally and have 90-degree angles at each one? And how do I then do the same for a triangle, an equilateral triangle, or a pentagon, which requires an exploration of the golden section to understand the pentagon? And once you do that and explore their relationships, you could then begin to not just discover objectively what is true in organizing the fabric of reality, which does involve a relationship of these core 5 solids, but you're doing it on the 2-dimensional domain, but you could then build it up and unfold these into cubes, into tetrahedrons, icosahedrons, dodecahedrons, and see, okay, well, what did my mind have to do differently that allowed for the construction and true understanding of what these are and what type of new proportions emerge out of comparing them together? If I nest them all into a sphere of the same size, how do their edges change proportional to each other? What types of harmonics might emerge, that might have some audio correlation that might be either pleasant or dissonant if I listened to the musicality of these proportions on a string. So he was a follower, in his own words, for example, in the Protagoras dialogue, of the Pythagorean tradition. And here I'm not referring to the mystical hermetic rebranding of the Pythagorean tradition, but I mean the real authentic thing as outlined by Timaeus in the actual Pythagorean friend of Plato, who survived the many destructive persecutions of the Pythagoreans and had the only sort of, I think, honest outline of what the doctrine actually was, that saw a co-development of the visual and audio space-times that would be something you could explore together by looking at the ironies and the cracks, and that would be real geometry. Yeah, so he understood that as you discover in this type of approach more about the objective world around you, you're also simultaneously discovering more about the nature and rules of your own mind being creative, because you're not just being a computer processing information, you're hypothesizing, you're discovering where a false hypothesis that was leading you on is untrue because it's not helping you solve the problem of, let's say, doubling the square. As he gets the slave boy of Meno the slave owner who has a slave child, he gets him to discover a challenge that requires the slave child also discover learned ignorance, right? Discovering that what you thought you don't know, which is a huge power to be able to get that discipline. And once you do that and you do it enough, you don't have to master everything, but once you have a taste for it, then you are qualified, as Plato put in the curriculum for his academy, you are then qualified to use the mind as a proper tool in an analysis of philosophy, of the pursuit of wisdom, of justice, of these other deeper questions, which have you without that rigor that you will have learned in music and geometry, you will not be able to approach it in a meaningful way that will not have you slip and get pulled into webs of sophistry, of false reasoning when trying to deduce, well, what is justice? What is these other big questions that are so impactful on the political world and the laws that we happen to be living in, and the just or unjust wars that we may find ourselves participating in as peons of some other agency that might mean us very ill effect. So all that to say, that was his academy. It was set up largely by the fruits of monies that were acquired by a payment. I don't know if you went through this in previous episodes, but he was slow.
I've touched on it a bit, and
okay.
And when you were describing kind of Plato's conception of how one learns and how one reaches this level of virtue, could you explain a little bit about his notion of epistemology, for example, and how the idea of virtue, so that we can frame that, so when we talk a little bit later about some of the competing frameworks, we can understand. You also mentioned the Meno, which is one of his well-known dialogues. Just talk a little bit about how Plato used those dialogues to reveal his epistemology.
And I hope that this conversation we're having encourages people to recognize that they need to read Plato himself, because this type of thing is like a nice stimulant, but it is not a substitute for actual knowledge. And I almost feel like I could say too much that might deprive people of the ability to make a discovery. I don't want to deprive people of the joy of making those types of discoveries on their own by reading Plato and sort of chewing on the ambiguity that he consciously embeds within his dialogues by design, because he's trying to stimulate us into thinking for ourselves and not giving us the type of satisfying, closed, fixed answers to questions that we often are accustomed to expecting in philosophical treatises like that, which we might see from the writings of an Aristotle or many of those philosophers in our modern day who tell us exactly what justice is, what to think about virtue and these things. Plato doesn't do that, which is why a lot of people are a bit uncomfortable at first reading him because he's not doing that, and they're like, is he toying with me? Is he toying with me, or does he not really know? And it's like, no, he's got some pretty strong ideas of what these things are. Don't get him wrong, even though he has his character Socrates, his teacher, often say that, he knows that he doesn't know, whereas everybody else thinks they know, and so he's still in a better place to ask questions and to help them become aware of what they thought they knew that they don't know based on a paradox, so it's useful. But they're like, no, but they're like, oh, is he really ignorant of everything? And it's like, no, he's got strong ideas. He's just, he knows that, one, those ideas are not perfect. They're not mathematically certain in such a way that they couldn't be made better. So he's got that flexibility and he's really cultivated as a muscle, and he wants other people to learn how to do that too. And it's more about the process. So about Plato, there is not a single dialogue that gives you a finished sense of satisfaction, thinking, okay, now I know everything I can know about this topic I was just reading about, which is a blessing and a gift that he's giving us, because he's giving us tools around which we can analyze anything and everything we wish to at all times, and that is universally applicable to anybody from any culture who uses this method. It's not an ideology, it's not an opinion, it's not even temporal. It'll be as applicable 1,000 years ago as it was 2,500 years ago when he was first writing them, and it was equally true before he was writing them. This was already a method. He just found a dialectic method of communication that made it something more transmissible transgenerationally in a self-conscious manner. It's something that I think children even organically do by being humble, naturally so. They have no artificial abstractions or constructs in their mind that are holding their creativity and their flow back. So when they're learning to walk or speak or do anything, they're trying things out. They're very they stumble, they fall, they try again. They're courageous because they try again. They're again humble. They don't think they know things, so they learn quickly. That bell curve is fast, and I think a lot of that has to do with a natural Platonic, what we call Platonic modality.
I just want to go back to something you said just before, because you're talking about the method, and then you brought up geometry. Just talk a little bit about how Plato saw mathematics as part of this formation, this kind of formative training, if you will. In other words, you didn't just bring this up randomly, I'm guessing. You brought this up within the context of Platonic method, if you will.
Yeah, well, that's right. And Plato's school was largely the merger of a pre-existing earlier school of Archytas, and one of Archytas' students, whose name is all of a sudden escaping me. It'll come later on probably. Who was organizing with Plato in the 380s in Egypt, and they went together to meet Archytas in near Syracuse, where they made their first attempt to actually create a philosopher king, to actually create a movement, or to be a part of an existent movement that they wished to direct and amplify in a geopolitical fight against a certain force that was controlling at that time the Persian Empire, a major nemesis of the Greeks, and as well as of the better of the Egyptians. So the students of these schools of Archytas basically worked with Plato, who developed his own students as well. These are Pythagoreans basically, and they formed the foundation of the first generation of his academy. And again, Archytas was a mathematician of his day. Part of when you're looking at constructive geometry is it's what distinguishes it from the bad way of communicating geometric concepts or mathematical concepts is that it's based on a firm understanding that the mathematical language, which is relatively symbolic, a little bit more arbitrary in terms of which symbols do you choose to represent numbers or multiplication symbols or whatever, but that it's a symbolic much language of math that is that must always follow in the dance between physical geometry, physics, which geometry is understood to be a shadow, a mapping of the physical geometries shaping the reality we live in. You look at a bubble, and a bubble takes on a certain characteristic, very, very similar to a sphere, right? And as they say, the bubbles pop, the sphere is eternal. So we can map as an object, an intellectual object, a sphere, of which in the physical world there will never be a bubble that is so perfectly spherical that a more perfect one cannot be imagined or formed. It's always we're in that type of imperfect world, but with these archetypical transcendental imprints shaping the constructs of, for example, atomic formation in minerals, which we find these beautiful patterns in silicates and other things of geometries that indicate something very, very ordered on the small, not chaotic, not random on the small, that expresses itself, or certain symmetries in the growth of the golden section in flowers, in living populations that we find everywhere where life is expressing an influence over matter. There is the golden section in a way that we don't find in non-living atomic arrangements or molecular arrangements. It's just not, we don't find the golden section so much present in the non-living domain. So these are all questions, that fivefold symmetry that comes with the pentagon, that comes with an investigation of the golden section, right? You find that fivefold symmetry in living things predominantly. Flowers and we find it more as we scale up in our exploration of the solar system. So Plato understood that, again, real geometry is based upon a pursuit of those eternal principles that shape the reality that our minds were created into, and that we can in turn influence by understanding what they are. If we're ignorant, they influence us, and we have our free will has no agency in influencing any of those things outside of us in a meaningful way if we remain in a state of ignorance. But as we develop knowledge through eurekas, through discoveries that are genuine, not memorized, those forces are awoken within us, because in Plato's idea, as he outlines in so many of his dialogues, including the Meno, but also the Phaedo, that a real discovery is more akin to the quality of a recollection than it is to adding something to an existent vessel. So yeah, like in the Aristotelian framework, for example, there's more of an idea that learning is adding things to a vessel. You're putting things into a student, or you're writing on a tabula rasa. You're putting things into. It's not like that in any way for a teacher using the Platonic method, or Plato or his teacher Socrates. For them, it's you're presuming that everything already is there in a latent way within the student. The entire universe and all of creation is imprinted on the soul. It's kind of like a fractal of that student, and that it requires simply to be awoken like a flame. You're lighting a flame from within by posing questions in a certain way and giving the space for the student to make mistakes, to be frustrated, to not try to overly satisfy that frustration prematurely by giving them an answer too quick before it's ripe. You don't want to pluck a fruit before it's ripe. So that takes a lot of discernment. That's not easy for a teacher to withhold, because it's satisfying to see a kid making a discovery. And sometimes a parent who wants their kid to drive a bike super badly might push their kid too much, and the kid will fall off and become afraid of the bike, or feel resentment towards the father or the mother. So, a good parent is the one who's not going to overly impose, and is going to create that space. So all that to say, in the Platonic idea of geometry, you're always thinking about, okay, how do I pose the questions so that the paradox of what they think that they like? So what does the Meno do? The slave boy do in the Meno dialogue? He's got the challenge of doubling the area of a square, and it seems simple enough on the surface. And he says, it's easy. I mean, you just extend the sides by double of the square. So he takes the square and he's like, okay, double a side. Now that works for a line for the one-dimensional domain, but for the two-dimensional domain, that he quickly discovers that he didn't double it, he quadrupled it. So we actually take the area, and the area is 4 times, not 2 times what he thought it was supposed to be. So he's like, I made a square, but it's now 4, not 2 times what I wanted, so I have to try again. And he tries something else, and it turns out that doesn't work. And he tries 2 or 3 things, that doesn't work. And then finally, by becoming self-aware of what he thought he knew he doesn't know, now all of a sudden the discovery that it's actually, and I'm not even going to say what it is because I don't want to steal the discovery from your audience, but it flashes like a light, and he actually discovers the solution to the problem. And around that, the master of the slave boy, whose name is Meno, who's actually a very shitty character in real life. He's actually the saboteur of one of the most important strategic military campaigns that Plato had participated in with Xenophon against Persia with the 10,000. That figure, Meno, as a real man in the real world, was the guy who betrayed the 10,000 to the Persian emperor and caused all of their generals to fall into a trap, get killed, and then forced Xenophon to take responsibility, a friend of Plato, to get the 10,000 out of deep, deep Persian territory, which, thank God, he was successful. But that Meno character was a very, very influential oligarchist, and he was himself, in that dialogue, less creative than his own slave, the person he owned, the child he owned as a slave. He didn't want, the original challenge was posed to him. And Plato demonstrated that the person who, like a Meno personality type, who believes in slavery and these things, they will be less creative than even a slave. And that was, I think, one of the best demonstrations that gave rise to a potent anti-slave movement, which even Aristotle later on, decades and decades later, had to deal with, because Aristotle was very much in support of slavery and even said that slavery is the natural order, but he had to acknowledge that many misbegotten philosophers in his day believed that slavery was unnatural. And he's like, no, these people are wrong, but these are the people who are the real Platonists, who he's saying were wrong. And he then develops his treatise on why certain people are born for being ruled over and being enslaved, and certain people are born to rule. So he's basically creating a framework to validate the existence system that he happened to be loyal to in the world that he practically lived in. So there's that aspect.
So Matt, I just want to stay on the Meno for a second, because you touched on a bunch of different points, and I just want to get to put this within the framework of
what is virtue?
No.
Oh, because you never asked.
Thank you.
Right.
I wanted if you wouldn't mind your interpretation of what lesson Plato was using these characters within this dialogue, and what his lesson of virtue was.
Of course, yeah. Because that's the whole point, right? It's like, what is virtue? That's the whole point of this lesson, out of which a segue occurs with this geometric problem. I think, and this is the brilliance about Plato, is that you will find that the answer isn't like, because what's the first part of the dialogue? It's like, okay, well, he's asking Meno first, and Meno's giving these hypotheses of what is virtue, and he's like, there's a virtue for the master, and a virtue for the slave, and a virtue for the woman, a virtue for the husband, and he's trying to go into little mini exhibitions about like what each one is. There's a virtue of being obedient, and a virtue to, and Plato's like, whoa, you're like, I'm like somebody. He's like, you gotta speak to me a little bit more simply, dude. I'm like somebody who just asked for a vase, and instead of giving me a vase, you broke it into pieces, give me little parts, saying that these are one vase. And I'm like, I don't want parts of a vase or different. I want, what is the thing that ties all of these different virtues together? What is the thing that calls virtue, that gives virtue meaning as a term? And that's where Meno just intellectually breaks down. You realize he has never thought about these unifying characteristics that transcend all of the multiplicity of parts, which is a common problem that people have to this very day, where people get offended by the word, like you said, progress or freedom or humanity or these general terms. They get even offended by emotionally because they've been so misconditioned to think about wholes as merely sums of parts that don't have a transcendental quality tying everything together. They've been told that doesn't exist, and anybody who tries to allude to that is a fascist or is a latent totalitarian. And so if you don't want to be an authoritarian personality, you must reject that emotionally outright, even before you think about it. So it's a weird like trigger that even was existent back then, and you could see Meno running away. And it takes time for Plato to like get out of he's like, okay, we're not getting anywhere in the philosophical realm here. He's like, this is not working. So he shifts gears where he's like, okay, let's practically just try and exercise. And you discover that by virtue of the child making the discovery and the love that Socrates has as a sentiment that is guiding this kid and the whole thing, it's very giving, that virtue is never explained logically, but it's demonstrated what it is. And I think that's the thing he's trying to get us to zero in on, is it's like what is a great classical painting is different from just a banal painting that might be painted at the same temporal period as a classic of a Rembrandt or something, versus a mediocre painter who has talent but is maybe not doing what Rembrandt is doing. Well, it's because the theme of the painting is outside of the frame. It's something which he's using. He's choosing to set up the construct of imagery within a painting in order to challenge the viewer, the spectator of the painting, to become more self-aware of something that is outside of that construct. And the same thing for the dialogues. I would say the virtue is not in the definition, isn't in any of the elements, but all of those elements within the whole construct of that dialogue help you triangulate in on what is the virtue of Socrates that we want to kindle and awaken in our own heart. And the more you yourself practice the method with an honest heart and help other people struggle with a geometrical problem without giving them the answer, the more a virtue, a true virtue, a goodness, an ennoblement of the soul is awoken in that person, and they become better. But if you don't do it and you keep it in the intellectual realm, and it's not done if you don't apply it in the practical world and bridge the abstract from the practical, if you don't do that, then those virtues, those perfections will not heal our confused or wayward souls, and it'll remain in that dichotomized state. So it has to be always, I think Plato is writing these dialogues with the idea that he is intending for first his students in the academy to actually act to perform and work them through as exercises intellectually, but then to also be better people who use them going out of the school as they become advisors of governments, advisors of military generals themselves, as Xenophon found himself and others. So there's this idea of unifying those two worlds of physical and metaphysical together, with the metaphysical leading in the dance, just like geometry has the physics leading in the dance, where mathematics would be expected to always follow and be guided by the discoveries we make in the physical world, not the inverse, where today, for example, is the opposite, where we start with mathematics and then geometry, and then physics is somehow relegated to the back burner as something which we expect should abide by that whatever mathematical language we happen to be adherent to at any given moment, which is not a way to make a discovery. It's a way to create explanatory models, but not to create a true understanding of anything or a greater power that should accompany, a real understanding should accompany an increased power to act and live and improve upon yourself, humanity, and the universe as a whole when you have real knowledge. That power doesn't come when you're just using memorization, when you're just using math, or just trying to fit the world into your model. That doesn't happen. We become, if anything, more enslaved to the illusion of knowledge, but actual true ignorance is holding us down and keeping us in a state of basically Plato's cave. The allegory of the cave, I think, is a perfect one for describing what happens when people become too well adapted to artificial or unnatural systems that misplace or that invert the cause from the effect, as math should always be the effect of geometry.
This concludes part 1 of a 3-part episode with Matt Ehret. Parts 2 and Parts 3 follow in episodes 12 and 13 respectively. Matt's thesis primarily is this: the Platonic tradition is not a chapter in the history of philosophy, but a living theory of what makes genuine human progress possible. And its suppression, he argues, is the central story of why progress so often fails. In the next episode, episode 12, Ehret takes up the allegory of the cave and argues that two very different groups have each misread it for their own purposes, and both leaving out the part that changes everything. I hope you'll enjoy it. Sources, reading, and today's transcript could be found at notionsofprogress.com. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find Notions of Progress on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And all the sources, reading recommendations, and further context for every episode are in the show notes. If you are enjoying this series, liking the episode on YouTube and signing up for the newsletter at notionsofprogress.com really helps more people find these ideas. For those who want to go even deeper, the Curator's Flame blog and Substack newsletter accompany each episode with the questions the scholarship leaves open. I'm Marshall, tracing ideas of progress from antiquity to the age of AI and leaving the debates open for you to consider. Until next time.